Today I'm doing an enforcement program overview. This overview is actually follow-up from prior discussions that the board had with staff focusing on the enforcement program, and in particular our consent orders and civil charge calculations and penalties that are included as a part of that order. So that'll be the primary focus of the overview and the presentation today. So I'll walk through and touch on the enforcement principles generally, and then move into a discussion of our formal enforcement orders, in particular the special consent orders that are routinely presented to the board, talking about our civil charges, the methods and requirements for calculating those, and then the other elements that might be included in those enforcement actions or orders related to cost and injunctive relief. So the enforcement program coordinates and works with the permitting and compliance program to support the mission of ensuring compliance with Virginia's environmental laws and regulations. The mission carries forward to specific enforcement goals that are identified and derived from statutory provisions and other requirements and goals of the department. That includes effective, timely, and appropriate enforcement actions, consistent, certain, fair, and reasonable actions to bring parties subject to violation into compliance and preclude continuing violation, to recover civil charges and penalties where appropriate, including amounts sufficient to remove the economic benefit of non-compliance. Specifically within this context, and our goals is identified within the statutory provisions related to DEQ, which requires that we ensure that we have a program of enforcement that is consistency among private and publicly owned entities. So actually within our missions and requirements are to ensure consistency in our enforcement program. So again, today we're focusing on formal enforcement, which generally is where we look at an issuance of a notice of violation and moving forward. The department, as a part of the overall scheme of compliance and enforcement, of course, does have escalating compliance and enforcement actions, particularly where there are violations that are insignificant and can be relatively addressed quickly. Those might be addressed through the more informal enforcement measures, whereas warranted based on the evaluation and review. Then we'll have an issuance of a notice of violation, and that results in what we refer to as a referral for formal enforcement. Within that formal enforcement context, we focus primarily on the enforcement orders. Those are orders that allow for and require compliance along with the collection of civil charges or civil penalties. The most common of which is, of course, the consent special orders, which are those orders that are routinely presented to the State Water Control Board or executed by the department that include both a civil charge and, where necessary, corrective action, and I'll talk more about that moving forward. Separately, there are provisions related to unilateral orders, but those are established by statute and limited by such. So for example, there is within the provisions for Virginia Code 10.1-1186 the ability to issue a unilateral order. However, the limit there is set at $10,000 and the duration of that order can only be for 12 months. Beyond that, there's a unilateral order option as well within the State Water Control Law and other media laws, but it also has limits. Specifically, no more than $100,000 can be included in any civil charge for that order. And it also has other jurisdictional requirements before it can be issued, including the fact that there has to be 2 notices of violation, 120 days more apart, outstanding noncompliance, and of course, that has to be subject to a formal hearing. Additionally, when we look at orders and potentials for collection of civil penalty and ordering compliance, we can evaluate for potential referral to the Office of the Attorney General, and that process includes a review by them of the action to be able to move forward through the judicial system to result in an order and or penalties there as well. Primarily within the formal enforcement context and our consent civil charges, we talk about the ability for the department to collect civil charges, or they're actually referred to civil penalties in a different context. Those are established as a maximum within various statutes. Typical maximums are $32,500 per day per violation. That's the provisions established for in the State Water Control Law related to the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, the Virginia Stormwater Management Act, the underground storage tank and above ground storage tank provisions. There are different provisions within the purview of the State Water Control Board for other programs that do have variations on that amount, including a $25,000 maximum within the groundwater withdrawal program. There's actually a $2,500 maximum related to the VPA program for poultry and AFOs. And then there's also some additional sub-provisions within the statute related, for example, for an oil discharge in terms of the amount per gallon, as well as some additional provisions where there's a more limited land disturbance within the erosion and sediment control law that are reduced. Each of these statutory provisions, though, and within all of the media statutory provisions, though, there is the requirement for there actually to be the development of guidelines and procedures for determining how a civil charge will be calculated pursuant to an action or a civil charge. And in fact, the statutes provide specific factors, which I'll touch on more in terms of what that civil charge determination has to be. So although the statute provides a maximum in terms of the per day per violation, that same statutory provision includes specific factors that have to be utilized in calculating what any civil charge or penalty should be. Those guidelines and procedures as required by statute are outlined in our DEQ Civil Enforcement Manual, which is the manual and guidance that is utilized for evaluating in our formal enforcement actions, how to go about addressing and including those statutory factors in our civil charge calculations. Specifically within the statutory factors, and this, for example, is a reference to the state water control law within the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System requirements, the factors that are identified in 4415AE that have to be included in any civil charge calculation, and I'll touch on them briefly. One factor that has to be accounted for is the severity of the violations. This, for example, in the department's calculation, looks at the violation type and frequency, as well as potentially the including a flow reduction factor. Specifically, we look at the environmental harm and the potential impact to the program related to the violation that has been identified. That also is required to be factored into, as outlined in the statute, the extent of any potential or actual environmental harm. So the resulting impact from any potential violation or any actual violation identified in enforcement action to look at the extent of that actual harm. That looks at and is included within our calculations and is identified in our guidance and a worksheet, for example, divided into 3 separate categories: serious, moderate, and marginal, depending upon the extent and the actual harm. Then another factor is the compliance history of the facility or the person. That's translated in the department's calculations and in the guidance pursuant to that statute to look back for a specified time as to any compliance or non-compliance within a period both related specifically to the media of the violation or to a different media. Additional factor is the realization of any economic benefit from non-compliance. In that perspective, the department looks at specifically if there was what's referred to as avoided or delayed economic benefit, as we require within the enforcement actions that are taken either prior to execution, for example, if a consent order are included in that, is ensuring that there is compliance with the law or regulation. So the economic benefit realized from non-compliance is really to capture if there was some sort of delay or some compliance that could not be achieved and being able to capture that appropriately, particularly where it's above a de minimis amount. EPA actually provides models that are able and utilized by the department to look at where you've got a cost related to any economic benefit, to be able to calculate, for example, interest saved from delayed compliance, so that that can be factored into any civil charge as well. And the last factor is for the department and any civil charge to actually look at the ability of the person to pay the penalty. Again, EPA has models that are provided that are able to do this sort of analysis, looking at individuals or corporations, municipalities, or other entities that are able to look at the financial information that are submitted to be able to do an analysis as to the ability of the person to pay the penalty. What I would note there with regards to the ability to pay analysis, although we look at and consider that within those models for the actual civil charge itself, we do not look at the ability to pay to comply. Compliance would still be required regardless of an ability to pay analysis. The ability to pay is solely focused on the civil charge or civil penalty portion. So those factors, and as I mentioned, actually translate into our guidance into specific worksheets within each individual media or programs that identify and capture those factors. So this worksheet that I've provided as an example is within the VIPTES program, and it translates those factors that are identified by statute into a worksheet to be able to calculate and determine the appropriate civil charge for any enforcement action or civil charge for a consent special order. That then identifies within the gravity, the extent and nature of any potential harm, the types of violations. It adds on the aggravating factors or additional considerations, for example, whether the facility is what's identified or defined as a major facility, looking at the compliance history, as I mentioned, and taking in and factoring within the amount any non-compliance within the same or different media over a period of time, looking at the culpability, the extent and the amount that they knew or should have known of the requirements, the foreseeability or the ability to address or remedy the non-compliance, and then of course the economic benefits of non-compliance and the ability to pay where that calculus is a part of the individual evaluation for that facility. There's also a flow reduction factor that's accounted for example, in VIPTES, again, going back to the factor related to extent and potential impact for those low flow sewage treatment plants. So that worksheet is how the department translates those specific statutory factors that have to be applied across all media to determine an appropriate civil charge. And in doing so, be able to translate that back to being able to ensure that the mission and requirement of having consistency in the enforcement program is utilized. When we do collect civil charges, they are identified, and as you often see or hear within the consent special orders, to a specified fund. There's 3 primary funds that those civil charges or penalties go to, including the Virginia Environmental Emergency Response Fund, which is the primary fund for the Commonwealth of Virginia to address environmental pollution incidents. It also is a fund that's utilized to deal with and carry financial obligations for surplus sites that the Commonwealth may have. The next is the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund, which is the program fund that's utilized for remediation and cleanup of petroleum spills or tank releases. And then, of course, the Stormwater Assistance Fund, which provides funding for stormwater projects, particularly at the local level. Oftentimes, or sometimes within the civil charge calculus and the consent orders, there's a presentation of a supplemental environmental project. These are authorized by statute. They specifically allow, in lieu of payment of funds, money into those identified funds to be directed towards projects. There are statutory requirements tied to those projects, including that they have to have a required nexus to whatever the violation was, and you do have to demonstrate an equivalent offset. So if someone does, for example, has a $25,000 civil charge, they do a $20,000 theft, they have to submit documentation and demonstration that in fact $20,000 was spent for whatever the identified project was. And that's required and identified in statute as well. Additional costs or elements of a consent special order or formal enforcement action would also include cost reimbursements. There's specific provisions within the state water control law to provide for the recovery when there is a fish kill for the investigative costs and the replacement cost of the fish. Specifically within that statutory provision is for recovery for any staff time into that investigation, with the remainder of funds to be utilized and provided to the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries to look at replacement or habitat impact cost. One distinction that we do sometimes have within this framework is, depending upon the nature and extent of that, and where appropriate, our federal trustee partners may do an analysis and determine that a natural resource damage assessment claim is a more appropriate action to deal with fish kills and recoveries. Those actions are led by the federal trustees under the Clean Water Act, the Oil Pollution Act, or CERCLA, to do more large-scale replacement and recovery where there's been significant damage, and Virginia is identified as one of the trustees for doing that, and in those instances the fish kill costs may be recovered as a part of that larger federal action. There's also reimbursement costs related to the Virginia Environmental Emergency Response Fund when staff have to go out on a pollution incident response, for example, where there's a fish kill or a spill of significant nature. There's statutory provisions that provide for the department to be able to recover those funds as well, in addition and beyond any civil charges or other costs in an enforcement action. And of course, consistent with the requirements and the missions in supporting the compliance program, there will be included where necessary injunctive relief or corrective action. Frequently, and as you all have seen with the consent special orders that are presented, compliance is achieved prior to actual execution or presentation of the action dealing with the civil charge. Compliance and that achievement becomes first and foremost, so we don't delay ensuring or having the RP achieve compliance prior to actually execution or implementation of the consent order. Where it is necessary as a part of the ongoing efforts to address compliance or to include other measures, that's when we'll have a schedule of compliance or injunctive relief included, which may include a corrective action plan, which is the long-term plan in order to be able to address any outstanding or additional non-compliance or take other measures to ensure that the facility ultimately can comply with any of their requirements. And I'm going to stop there and ask if you have any questions.
I'm looking at the worksheet that you provided, and I was wondering why item 4, which was spills unpermitted discharge, why would the most serious occurrence, severe or serious, it's hard to read even with my reading glasses, be $13,000, and why wouldn't it be $32,500, which is...
So that's one line item. So again, because of all the factors, that would be one element of the calculation, and then you would look at the aggravating factors, which is another statutory required factor, compliance history, to then be within that framework of the maximum of 32.5. So because we're required to, by virtue of those statutory factors, look at all of those elements, the worksheet accounts for taking all of that in to be able to still have to stay within the statutory maximum of 32.5. So you may very well have an unpermitted discharge where you have the 32.5, depending on the total calculus of all of those factors. So that one line item relates to the factor for the extent and the actual impact of the harm, and then we would provide the additional calculus related to the compliance history, culpability, and so forth. Within that, so the 32.5 provides...
yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Did you start at 32.5 as the maximum and then figure out all these like breakdowns? Well, you start with a calculus within the worksheet, but the worksheet accounts for the fact that we have to take all of those factors and translate to a maximum of 32.5. Per day, right, yes. Yeah, okay. So within that framework. So you actually might have multiple worksheets like this for multiple programs, multiple media, although if there's multiple violations, they may be accounted for depending on the nature within the same worksheet. But yes, so it's all to translate, again, to be able to take those factors and apply them consistently within that framework for any of our enforcement actions. So the worksheet is designed to ensure that all of those factors are addressed and to also account for that maximum framework. Well, one of the things I was wondering was, when was the last time this was updated?
So it was updated in 2016, and that is part of our regular evaluation. We'll actually, as a part of additional efforts under the Executive Order 6, be looking at furthermore, additionally more with the guidance. Anytime we do look at penalties, though, and we look to make those changes, again, consistent with the statute, it has to be done holistically within the framework of a guidance revision and looking at across the board to maintain that consistency.
Do we adopt the guidance, or is that no?
No, so guidance is promulgated pursuant to the APA by the Department department on behalf of the board.
Okay.
But that guidance is available. It's publicly available, as with all of our guidance on our website, to provide that information and framework to individuals.
Okay, and how does the cost saving for the violation, okay,
So there's a specific item and for the economic benefit of non-compliance.
economic, that's what.
So what we do there is we look at a couple of different analyses. Again, because we do not and ultimately require compliance, unless compliance cannot be achieved by virtue of the violation, then we look at the delayed cost, for example. And the guidance specifically outlines where it's more than de minimis, that's an element to be captured, and that's where we might look at the EPA models. Economic benefit of non-compliance is one of the more challenging aspects in terms of analysis, just because depending on the nature of the violation, there may not be a clear or direct correlation to some defined value. So so if you're talking about, for example, a piece of equipment that was delayed being installed there, you could look at the cost and that savings amount, for example, over a period of time. Some, for example, related to an effluent, there's no direct connection that you're able to capture an actual tangible economic element of that. But again, that's where we also look at the other elements of the worksheet and those factors to make sure that we're still assuring that the civil charge is appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Can you explain, under the maximum penalty established in statute, the difference or how you would interpret groundwater withdrawal at 25,000 and then VPA poultry at 2,500?
So that's gonna relate back to the notice of violation and what the identified violations were and what the statutory framework is. So the VPA is a very specific statutory provision related to those poultry waste cases or animal feeding operations that have a VPA permit. So if that was the underlying violation at issue, then that statutory framework would provide that maximum. With the groundwater withdrawal, for example, when you're talking about the groundwater withdrawal program and the permitting or requirements there, then that statutory framework is the baseline for the violation, so that provides the maximum within the framework of that context.
So if it's a poultry operation and a groundwater withdrawal violation for poultry, which fee applies?
So where there's multiple violations or where you have a violation, either multiple media, then we would go with if it was a groundwater withdrawal at a poultry, then that would be with the groundwater withdrawal program. So I just wanted to highlight, because there are distinguishes with the variations of amount, that VPA for the poultry and the animal feeding is a very limited set of circumstances related to that VPA permit. It doesn't create that framework just because you have a poultry house, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.